The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. Most people imagine that the inner kingdom, as Jesus described it, lacks the fascination that they attribute to the sense life, the bright lights, the diverse attractions, the joys and the laughter. Little do they realize what a vast universe exists in their own selves. There are many passages in the Old and New Testaments of the Bible that describe aspects of this inner kingdom. In the book of the Genesis, we read, "And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil." This garden was in no earthly place. It exists even now in the very self of every human being. The legend of Adam and Eve is allegorical. It describes how the first human beings dissipated their spiritual energy, centered in the spine. The spine is the channel through which flows the river of baptism of the spiritual life. The Bhagavad Gita tells us the wise speaks of an eternal Aswata tree with its roots above and its branches below. The tree of life, spoken of also of Genesis, is the spine. Its roots are above in the brain's energy. Its branches are the outward spreading nervous system. When the sap, which is to say the energy, flows downward, the consciousness is drawn into delusion. On the other hand, when the energy is drawn upward in deep meditation, the consciousness is drawn towards its eternal source, God, and it is the last untied within. Let's do that again. On the other hand, when the energy is drawn upward in deep meditation, the consciousness is drawn towards its eternal source, God, and is at last united with Him. Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, therefore, urges his chief disciple Arjuna to embrace the yoga science, the path of meditation. The yogi, he says, is greater than the ascetic, greater even than the followers of the path of wisdom, jnana yoga, or of action, karma yoga. Be thou, O Arjuna, a yogi. For those who would find the divine truth, Krishna gives this description of the yogi. Steadfast as a lamp burns, sheltered from the wind, steadfastly meditating solitary. Such is the likeness of the yogi's mind, shut from senses storms and burning bright to heaven. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
Welcome to Sunday service, everyone. My name is Peter. This is my wife, Marga. It's our pleasure to share service with you. Especially want to welcome those who are here with visitors and guests. I understand we have a number of programs going on this weekend at the Expanding Light. There's just a Memorial Day getaway, or sharpening your creativity, or deepening your meditation practice. So hopefully there'll be something for everyone in this service. I'd like to start by reading from Whispers from Eternity. This is a book of prayer demands by Paramahansa Yogananda. I disconnected my awareness from the little garden plot of the senses and switched it to the vast territory of the infinite. The aurora of my awareness spread like dancing waves of light in the aurora borealis and embraced thy cosmic wonderland. When thus I entered that vast panorama, my awareness no longer dulled by the opiate of sensory noises, nor blindfolded by the veil of mere appearances. I stood marveling before countless streams of radiant, rushing thoughts, rippling through millennia of long dead, still living, and yet to be born civilizations. All time, past, present, future, danced its infinitude of rhythms on the stage of my all-embracing consciousness. So reality isn't quite what we think it is. We know this, we're told this, but yet we're bound by our senses. We come here, we're sitting in a chair, we walk into a room, we feel the floor beneath us. I have to walk through here, we're at a specific time at space, 11:30 on a Sunday. It all just seems way too real. how do we get beyond that? I mean, even science now tells us that there's something vastly different going on here, but we're bound into those sensory perceptions, those outward things going around us. We know that there's energy all around us. There's a vast spectrum of electromagnetic fields that are here right now. They're all around us. We can perceive only a little bit of that. There's television programs rushing through this room right now. Who knows? We have cartoons. We may have Oprah. We may have cell phone conversations zipping right through here. We know that, but it's yet we're bound. We don't have that perception. When I got up here, I had to walk up here and sit on the floor. I mean, wouldn't it be kind of cool if we said, boom, the voice of God calls us awake, and then minister just appears here? I mean, that'd be pretty cool, but we're not quite there yet. And, science can tell us all these things, but even that is just a limited amount. They're exploring the universe both inward and outward and all these spectrums of energy. But we live in an age of energy, and we're still just beginning to expand that awareness. The yogis come in, as it tells us in this reading, they're the true ones that know the masters, and they say, reality is even vaster than all that, vaster than the cartoons and cell phone conversations, that there's actually streams of consciousness flowing through this room right now, that all thoughts are universally rooted. They're not individually rooted, Yogananda said. So we're a being here tuning into these streams of consciousness coming through us. We're all transmitting and receiving. All those people sitting next to you, there's things going on inside their head right now. Some of it might be focused on what Peter's saying, but a lot of it may be other streams of consciousness about what's for lunch and what are my kids doing and where am I going? Oh yeah, what? We're at service, right? Okay, and get back. So there's this vast ocean of consciousness all around us that we don't really know how to get there. But there's these models that the yogis, or the true scientists, have come to realize. They're the ones that have tuned in over the years. And most people would deny this inner reality. I mean, it's hard enough for us to relate to this energy reality that science tells us is there, let alone to relate to this much, much broader reality of consciousness. I mean, as it said in the readings, as you get out of the little garden plot of the senses and move into the vast territory of infinitude, you start looking at all thoughts of men, past, present, to come, of the civilizations dead, now present, and yet to be born, those rushing, radiant thoughts. It's all around us. We live in this sea of consciousness. And the yogis give us this model that we can look about, that we talk about in this reading today, that the tree of life is one way to look at it. And that metaphor has obviously been around for a long time. There was references to it in the Old Testament, the New Testament, it's in the Bhagavad Gita. There's a model of what's really going on here that we can tune into. And that says, what is it? It says that the tree of life, there's the tree, but it's an inverted tree. And it means the roots are up in the top, in the head. The brain is gathering in energy. It's bringing it into our central consciousness. And it's brought down in the trunk, in the spine. So in the tree it's going up, but in us it's upside down tree. It's coming down in our spine. And then it goes outward through the branches of the nervous system. And then it goes out into the sensory objects, or the leaves. In the Bhagavad Gita reading, it talked about the Ashwatha tree. That's a tree that's a fig tree, so it has very big leaves. And Yogananda said the buds are the senses, and when it gets out into the leaves, that's all our sensory involvement. That's these things that keep us here, that say I'm standing on a floor, that I'm enjoying this talk, that I'm enjoying being here, that some things I don't like. That's all the sensory involvement outside of us. It's actually a much more refined model than that. That model is a metaphor. It's something that's been given to us through many, many years and many ages. But there actually is a much more refined way of looking at it too, that the yogis, the true masters of India, have given us. And a lot of people think that, this is, they read this stuff and just, I can't perceive this. I can't relate to this. How can you tell me that this is truth? But when you think about it, yoga is really a science. And yoga, the models that the yogis have given us over these thousands of years, they really hold up even to the current epistemology of science, or the way of knowing that we have today of science. So what do scientists do? Scientists, they observe something, they describe it, they think up all kinds of new terms and vocabularies and mathematical ways of looking at it. They generalize, they try to create some formula, some way of modeling this, models of prediction. They make some predictions, they retest and verify that, then they refine it, and then they use those models to predict and to control and to manipulate our world. So that's basically the epistemology that we live with, epistemology of science. It's the way we've come to have such wonderful things as cartoons zipping through the air here and cell phones. There's these models. Well, the yogis applied the same techniques with one big exception. So they used their own bodies as the instruments. Instead of saying the scientists do now, we spend billions and billions of dollars to create more and more sensitive instruments that we can find, tune, and perceive greater, farther out in the universe, farther within ourselves, greater senses of reality. But the yogis refined the instruments of themselves. They took their own bodies, their own nervous systems, and through techniques, through applying willpower, through applying energy, they fine-tuned the instrument of themselves. And then they did exactly the same thing. They observed what was happening. They described that reality that they saw. They created models. They created ways of thinking about it, principles. They taught those to others. They told other people, if you can do this and fine-tune your instrument, you will perceive these same things. They got them to verify. There's a verification process going on. And then they made predictions, and they used that to get to the true thing that they wanted. So the scientists wanted us to be able to see cartoons and talk on cell phones. The yogis wanted us to experience the ultimate nature of bliss, of love, of pure consciousness. And so it really is a very scientific study that they gave us. And this was passed down from higher ages through the teachings of yoga into a very, very refined models. And again, they're models, and we don't really understand it because our instruments aren't yet pure enough to really perceive that and to verify it. But it's the same way as with the scientists, the physicists. How many of us really understand what the physicists came to when they were able to start controlling radio and television waves and doing that? We don't really understand it, but we know there's a model there, there's a theory there that works. And we apply that theory and we use those things. Well, we can do the same thing and we can say, look at the masters, look at the yogis. Those models that they used appear to work. Why don't I embrace that and try to look at that and try to go ahead and use that? And it says that we don't have to know everything. We don't have to understand everything, but know that there's a very detailed progression of observation, of making theories, of applying these theories behind these yogic teachings. And the model that we're talking about today is we're talking about how the spine works, how the body works, how this being works. And instead of just a tree of life, they refine it a lot more. They say there's a brain, we're a triune being, there's astral, causal, and physical levels, all interspersed within that. There's energy coming in, being channeled into nadis, into nerve channels, into the spine, that trunk of the tree. There's processes, there's that energy's moving up and down, and it's moving outward to the branches, through the chakras, the energy centers. It moves outward into outside, and it's that pull of the likes and dislikes in our spine, that movement up and down, that pushes the mind to go outward, to look for pleasures, to look for enjoyment out in the senses. So our consciousness flows outward into the buds on the trees, the senses, and then out into that sensory involvement in the world. We get wrapped up in what's going on out there, that we like it, we don't like it. We are hungry, we're cold, we're hot, we're a student, we're a teacher, we're a parent. You just get wrapped up in all these things going on out there. And so instead that takes the energy that's coming in and it keeps it from going out. What do the yogis say? Is that if you really want to experience your true nature, your true peace, true bliss, true love, we have to reverse that flow. As I said in the reading, the sap has to move back to the roots. So we withdraw from the senses back into the inner spine, move that back, and move that up into the upper reaches of the brain, where we can perceive the higher realities that the yogis tell us are there. So how do we do this? There's lots of different ways to do it, and I want to talk about a few, but I also want to point out in the reading that it says, the Bhagavad Gita, it said, O Arjuna, be thou therefore a yogi. Because the yogic path, knowing this model, knowing this categorization of these ways that energy flows. I mean, just to give you an example, the yogis, when they mapped out these nadis, these nerve channels, we talk about the three main ones, the Irda and the Pingala, the upward and downward flow, and the deep spine, the Sushumna. But they actually mapped out some 72,000 nadis. And they have these pictures in the ancient sciences and how energy flows. And it was quite detailed. You can get quite into it. And Yogananda took that and distilled it down. But what he said is, and Krishna says in the Gita, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, Yoga Karma Yoga, being an ascetic, standing for 35 years with your hand up in the air. Those are all paths that have some merit. They have some value. But the highest, the truest, is to know that one, the best model that we can find. It's sort of like going back to the scientists again. If we say, I'd like to receive a radio reception, and there's the scientists who have a pretty complete picture of how radio waves work and radio reception and all that, and we could follow that way. Or there's people who receive radio stations on the fillings in their teeth, and we could say, well, that's a way of doing it. I could, try to get the fillings in my teeth just right until I could receive the radio reception. Or I could go with the higher models, the ones that seem like they're more complete, that they know a little bit what they're talking about, and I can build a radio receiver a whole lot easier. Well, it's the same thing with the yogis. You can do prayer, you can do devotional practices, you can do karma yoga, you can do any of the myriad of religious practices that are out there. But isn't it going to be better to take the most complete, the most comprehensive, the most all-embracing model or theory or principles that are going to help us get there the fastest? And that's what it says in the Bhagavad Gita. That's the yogic principles. Be thou therefore a yogi. Tune into those principles. Tune into that way of knowing, of being, of doing things. So how do we do that? There's the system of Patanjali, is a great exponent of yoga. And he outlined a progression that you have to go through. And Master in the Yogananda, in the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, explained his commentaries on the mystical text of the Rubaiyat. He said something very, very interesting, a very profound statement in his commentary. It's in Quatrain 31. He explains this relationship between the brain and the senses and the flowing nervous system and reversing the flow, bringing it back to the brain. But he says the nervous system is the one and only path to spiritual enlightenment. The human nervous system and its astral, causal, that whole, looking at the whole of it, that is the one path to spiritual enlightenment, regardless of religious affiliation. So it doesn't matter what you believe. Just like if you believe that radio waves only come through your fillings, you can't deny that there's a whole other thing going on out here. It doesn't matter if you believe it or not. They can receive radio waves in a radio receiver, not through your fillings. So it's the same way with us. People have all these religious practices. They don't have to understand these theories. They'll get some help for it. But the one true way, you are going to go down this progression of reversing the flow of energy back into the spine, the deep spine, up into the brain. That's what spiritual enlightenment is. That's the best, most complete model that we have at this point. So Patanjali outlined that, and he said there's a whole process, and you can work on various steps in the process, or you can work on the whole thing. It is a progression. You have to perfect each step as you go, but then you can also work on the steps as you come. So there's the yamas and niyamas of philosophically getting your life together, of affirming and living in a way that'll further that spirituality. There's the ability to sit still, to still the body. That's asana, just being able to sit still, because you're probably not going to realize these inner truths, this inner kingdom, if you got a lot of things going, if you're moving around and you're bound to these senses in your body. The next one is the control of the energy. That energy, that prana, it has to be reversed and sent inward. And the fifth step is one I want to focus on a little bit today, because it has to do with that inner kingdom. And that's pratyahara, that's interiorization. And Swami talks a lot about it in his book, Awaken to Superconsciousness. There's a wonderful chapter about interiorization there, and I wanted to touch on a few points. And the further stages are focusing, concentration, concentration on the divine, and finally samadhi. But that's a whole, that's the whole science of yoga. But I want to talk a little bit more today about the interiorization, since we're talking about the inner kingdom today. And interiorization is, Swami points out, is not something that's just a byproduct of meditation, the fruit of meditation. Although certainly when we're meditating, we're trying to bring our thoughts within, we're trying to focus and bring the energy up, and it does help us in that process. But he says it's also, and very importantly, it's an attitude that should be practiced in your daily life. So just as the techniques of yoga can help you reach these steps, we can also practice the attitudes that bring us better results in meditation. So practicing an attitude of interiorization. Well, what does that mean? That means instead of living out on the periphery here without all these sense pleasures and sense objects, try to keep relating those back more to the interior. So when you see a beautiful flower or a beautiful day outside, try to perceive that more inside in the inner self than thinking of it as the object out there. When you hear beautiful music, Swami says, try to listen to it deep in your inner ear, especially the right ear where you hear the sound of Om. Try to bring sounds in there. When you taste good food, try to taste it here at the spiritual eye. So feel that there's a sensation, but it's coming from here. It's coming from deep within you. What happens is we're looking to focus more on the sensations within rather than on the objects that we're perceiving those sensations coming from. So focus on what's happening in here, the joy, the love, the beauty that you feel, rather than saying, oh, it's a flower, it's a concert, it's a good meal. Bring that inside. And the yogis have a technique that's very useful in being able to do this, and that's called titiksha. And titiksha can be translated as endurance, or just sort of enduring things, but it also has a couple more qualities that go with that. It has a sense of even-mindedness. No matter what's happening on out there, I'm just centered, calm in myself. It also has a sense of just being in that flow of being non-attached to just what's happening out there. So titiksha, a way to practice that would be, okay, if you're feeling, say you have a sensory perception, you're feeling very cold. And instead of going, oh God, it's cold, brr, ooh, I wish it wasn't so cold, you just say, okay, it's cold. And it doesn't mean act stupid and don't put on a coat. Go ahead and take care of the cold if you need to, but try not to have your consciousness flowing out there and judging and being centered on that. Or if it's hot, take care of something. Go ahead and take care of it, but try not to identify as there's something wrong, if there's something that's out there that shouldn't be. Just say, it is what it is. What comes of itself, let it come. I'm even-minded and cheerful under all circumstances. And so the perfection of titiksha is, as Yogananda put it, to stand unshaken amidst the crash of breaking worlds. So this is a very, very useful thing. Swami's talked a lot recently about, perhaps coming hard times and cataclysms and things. Well, what better way to prepare for that instead of storing food that, can go bad in a few years and all these things? Why not practice titiksha? Just say, no matter what comes, I'm even-minded and cheerful. I'm going to disassociate myself a little bit from the outside. Well, one thing is heat and cold. Although, as a village manager, I have to tell you, I have great hope for titiksha because I have to deal with, the utility bills and all that stuff. So I'm hoping if we can all perfect a little bit more in titiksha, our comfort range won't just be between 70 and 72. We could expand out to 80 and 60 and save a whole lot of energy on our heating and electric bills. So start practicing titiksha. But really it's a much deeper practice than that. And one thing with the sensory things, that's one thing. But when you start getting into some real pain, you say, okay, well, how do I deal with that? I'm really dealing with pain. And Swami talks often about practicing this in the dentist chair and being able to displace his mind and put it on something else and overcome that pain, or from especially emotional pain. That's a real hard one, isn't that? What really winds us up and really gets us going outwards when we hit those emotions? Well, it's just to try to disassociate yourself a little bit and to say, this isn't that important. This isn't that big. And there's a couple ways to do that. And one is to Kriyananda outlines is the breath. He said moving the awareness from out here in the reactive process back to more to its center, you can relieve that reactive process out there. So focusing on the breath like we do Hong Saw in meditation, but doing that during your daily life. If something has happened to you that you don't like your Peter came in and turned off the heat and you're really cold, you come in and you just breathe a little bit. Hong Saw, as we learn in the meditation technique. It'll center it away from the periphery, back more in the center to keep that reactive process. And again, what we want to do is to still the breath, still that reactive process completely so we can go into the deep spine. Another very important technique is expansion. And this is what Swami talked about when he's in the dentist chair with the pain, and he doesn't take Novocaine when he's having a tooth filling, and instead he just says he tries to expand beyond that pain. So look at that little bit of pain that's happening right now, and you say, well, what does that have to do with eternity? I'm a deathless, infinite soul. What does it have to do with even what's going to be happening in the next few days? It's a very small point in time and space. So instead of just focusing right in on there what's really bothering you, try to expand, to try to get that sense of consciousness much broader. And it's still there, and it's still pain, and it still needs to be dealt with, but we can expand ourselves much, much beyond that. When I was thinking about Titiksha and this interiorization, I actually had a realization. I'm quite a fan of John Muir's. And John Muir, for those of you who don't know him, was a naturalist, an explorer, a mountaineer who lived in the 1800s. His life extended into the 1900s a little bit. He was really the father of the conservation movement in America. He convinced through his writings that it was really important to preserve the natural world, the redwoods, the parks. He helped preserve Yosemite National Park. But what really has always struck me about John Muir is just the beauty of his writings. He was a real mystic. And when he writes about nature, about seeing the little flower people and the wonder of creation, he was very much related back to the divine. Then you read about John Muir's methods out in the wilderness, and you go, yeah, I just want to be like John Muir. Well, John Muir was the original sort of ultralight traveler, backpacker. I mean, he would go out for days just walking through the mountains with no more than his coat, a blanket, and a sack of bread and some tea. No tent, no flashlights, I don't even carry some matches probably because he made tea. Although sometimes he just put the tea leaves in his mouth and drink water because he wanted to get out there more quickly. But you start thinking about that and you go, yeah, I want to go do that. And, well, it's great when you're out there and it's a beautiful sunny day in the Sierras and you can commune with the flower people and all these wonders of nature. But John Muir does that during storms, during blizzards, during rainstorms in Alaska, when he's out there with his little blanket, and that's about it. And he spent, a week snowbound up on Mount Shasta at 12,000 feet in a blizzard. And he just said, I made a little shelter with my blanket over me, and I put my head on my bread bag, and I watched the crystals form on the blanket and was, wondering about the beauty of all the nature of those crystals. Well, that's Titiksha. I mean, if you can put your consciousness onto keeping it on that beauty, you've really interiorized something. And it's not that you're dead. I mean, when you do this, you're not dead to the beauties that's out there. It's just that you haven't deadened your consciousness. And if anything, meditation, expands it, makes it more aware. But you're able to not react so much to what's going on out there. Obviously, he was able to withdraw from being wet, cold, tired, hungry, and look at the little snow crystals forming on his thing and just wonder at that beauty of it. So it's a very wonderful practice, and it doesn't have to be just, the yogis. Obviously, John Muir, who didn't consider himself a yogi, was able to do that, was able to bring that all back. I've also found that it's a very good practice to practice for when you're traveling. Because traveling, especially if you're a tourist, you're traveling to go somewhere, you want to see new things, you're trying to get new experiences, you want to be open to what's out there, but oftentimes it can be a little bit uncomfortable. And you don't have the same food, and you don't have the same things that support you, and it can be trying. I mean, I remember once I was many years ago, I went to visit China, the People's Republic of China, when they had first opened the country to individual travelers. You didn't, for the first time, you could go in as a individual and not be with a tour. So I decided to take a boat from Hong Kong into Canton, Guangzhou. And I was very much into traveling on the cheap and traveling as the natives travel. And so I arrived at this boat, and they said, okay, the passengers are down below. And this was about a 60 or 70 foot flat deck boat with a deck down below. And you walk down below, and there was this little passageway in between, and then a couple feet up there was this shelf on both sides. And the shelf, I noticed, was divided into these little sections. And each section is about a little, 1x4 board was sticking up. Each section was about 5.5 feet long and about 2.5 feet wide. And this was going to be an overnight trip, the overnight boat. So they said, yes, sir. I didn't speak Chinese, of course. And they said, yes, sir, this way. Okay, here's your place. And so I said, oh, that's nice. This was obviously made for Chinese, and it wasn't made for someone like me. But there you are, and it was wonderful. And you sort of stretch out, and you get your body in there, and you had a little porthole too at the far end, this little door that could open up, about a 1x1 opening, and you could look out at the river going by. And so you stretched out and stuck your head out there and practiced tiksha, because you wanted to enjoy. I mean, it was thrilling, to see China and these, it was very, very different world, and to watch that go by. And at the same time, I needed to forget that I might be permanently deformed on my hips by trying to squeeze myself into this little platform. But the night passed, and it's another really good point with tiksha is, this is a favorite of my friend Rick Morehouse, is it'll always make a good story. So as you're thinking of something and you have to get by it, just say, okay, this will pass, and this is going to make a really good story somewhere. So as we practice that interiorization, just remember that it's not about us doing this interiorization, us becoming great yogis, us pulling our, I'm going to get the energy in and flowing upward. It's about getting back to who we really are, and it's about offering that sense back to the divine, because it's just as much of a trap as a yogi to think that I understand these models and I'm a great yogic scientist and I can do this and I can make my energy go where I want it to be. I. That's exactly what you're trying to get away from. You're tying it back to the that identification of ego. So whenever you do, whatever yogic techniques, make sure you're always offering that back to the divine. Make sure you're always offering it up into the grace that really is what's going to save us. Because getting into those points of practicing that, it allows us to open ourselves to what really is that oneness that's out there, that true self. Get rid of these barriers and get into that flow. So practice that devotion with whatever you do. And practice the tiksha, because I'm going to become turning down the thermostats. So. Thank you very much.
Peace gave us the mountains, peace gave us the sky, nightly when starlight and cold clouds, peace is its lullaby. Amen. us our